Hello, welcome to part 2 of the Crusades in context. So, regarding papal power, another area which the papacy was beginning to try and gain some control over was knightly violence across Europe. Now, you don't need to know a great deal of Christianity to know that Christ appears almost like a pacifist, turn the other cheek. Committing war was a sin, and many knights realised that this was sinful activity which they were doing. All this violence of besieging castles and attacking neighbours was not exactly in the Bible, so to speak. Now, the church have been obviously concerned about knightly violence for some time, and they had developed in the 500 years before the Crusades this idea called the just war theory. The idea that war is sometimes justifiable. It's justifiable, for example, if your lands are attacked by somebody else for you to retaliate. It's justifiable if it's a just cause. So there had been some attempt to try and clarify where war was perhaps justifiable. It was still sinful, but it was more justifiable. Now, in the early 1000s, there'd been a big increase in violence across Europe. You'd seen France, for example, the power of Charlemagne had ended, and you saw many knights fighting other knights in this time. What you didn't see very much of in terms of Christian warfare at this time was many pitched battles. Battles like 1066, the Battle of Hastings, which you might imagine was how medieval battles took place, were extremely rare. And the reason why they were really rare was because they had really big consequences, as was proven by 1066. What you often saw was a bunch of knights and a small army would besiege a castle, they'd burn it down, take the castle, and then they in turn would probably be besieged, 6 months later. And you had this kind of warfare that would take place. Now, what the church had done, and this wasn't done by the papacy, it was done by more local bishops, was in the early 1000s, in this area of France, there was the Peace of God movement and the Truce of God movement. And what they both sought to try and do was to limit kind of the consequences of these particular wars. So, for example, the bishops in the Peace of God movement said that it was particularly sinful if, church property was attacked. Those who couldn't defend themselves were attacked, so civilians, the old, women, etc., etc. The Truce of God movement, again, really done by local bishops. They tried to limit the days in which fighting could take place. You couldn't do it on a Sunday, because that was a religious day. There were various saint days where it was banned. And in 1041, I think they identified only about 80 days where any kind of fighting was permissible. So they're trying to contain, if you like, this violence. And it was the church trying to do this, but it was not so much from Rome. It was being done more by these local bishops and this particularly violent part of France, I suppose. Now, what you began to see was the growth of these more powerful popes, and perhaps one of the more powerful ones was Pope Gregory VII. Now, Gregory VII, who was pope from 1075 to 1085, he wanted to try and use this violence of the knights for his own ends, I suppose, and he twisted traditional spiritual kind of traditions which describe monks and things as being soldiers of Christ. What that was meant traditionally was that, monks and priests, they're fighting the devil. And this language, fighting the devil, for example, and there were soldiers protecting Christ and stuff against, the forces of evil. But what Pope Gregory tried to do was to twist it and to say that the lay community, i.e., knights and noblemen and ordinary people, they had one overriding obligation, which was to defend the church as if they were soldiers of Christ. And in his battle against the Holy Roman Emperor, which we'll come to in a few minutes, he actually tried to create what he called the Militia de St. Peter. And he tried to recruit supporters against the Holy Roman Emperor, who was having a dispute with. And he actually said, quote, "the danger of the coming battle for the remission of all their sins." So he was trying to say, if you come and help me against the Holy Roman Emperor, your sins will be forgiven. Now, this was so radical that actually it gained very little support for this idea. But, as we know from the Crusades, Urban II, who came from the same tradition as Pope Gregory. They both came from this abbey in Cluny as young men. He built upon this idea for the Crusades of 1095. So you've got this kind of spiritual kind of justification of war, and the idea that the Pope is trying to redirect some of this violence, possibly for his own ends, beginning to develop in the second half of this century, which again is clearly there under Pope Urban when this letter arrives from Byzantium. Now, the third area of papal power, well, was it the second area? I've lost count. A further area of papal power, increasing its power, is over politics. And in particular, again, this is under Gregory the where we see this take place, this Pope from 1075 to 85. What happened is this. The issue was that bishops, obviously they play an important role in the church, don't they? Bishops, they say mass and do all that kind of stuff, but they look after a large territory, and they're responsible for looking after the church over that large territory. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, in England, was basically responsible for all church matters from that kind of the River Trent, roughly where we are, in Nuneaton, I suppose, all the way down to the south coast of England. Huge amount of territory, and there's various bishops which have particular areas under that large area. Now, kings had always appointed their own choice of bishop. So a bishop would die, the King of England or the King of France would write to the Pope and say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but Bishop da-da-da-da has died. I decided to appoint this person to be the new bishop." And there wasn't very much the Pope could do about it. I mean, the Pope might not like the person who the king has appointed, but they're a long way down in Rome. And of course, kings were very keen to appoint people to these very powerful positions, have a lot of territory. They're keen to appoint people who they like. Which, from a king's point of view, is common sense, isn't it? You want to appoint people to these jobs who've got real power in your land, who you quite like. What you found, though, under Pope Gregory was he began to say, no, I want to appoint these sorts of bishops. In fact, when Pope Gregory became Pope, he actually claimed that he had authority that was superior to all earthly rulers, which really upset, as you can imagine, kind of the kings of this world, because they're like, oh, I've got all power in my area. Now, we don't need to go to the ins and outs, but there was a big row between the Holy Roman Emperor and Pope Gregory, and it was over the choice of a new Bishop of Milan. And to cut a long story short, what happens is that the Pope excommunicates, says that you're going to go to hell, the Holy Roman Emperor. There's a big standoff for about 4 or 5 years between the two. In the end, the Emperor begs forgiveness from Pope Gregory. But this kind of confrontation led to a number of kind of noblemen supporting the Emperor. They were all excommunicated. Some of these people, by the way, joined the First Crusade, and it may have been a reason why, possibly. You also saw this idea, as was said before, about this kind of holy war idea being fermented in Pope Gregory's mind, because obviously his idea of the holy war was to try and use that to try and attack Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, we can go a bit far in saying, the papacy was getting more and more powerful. Look what Pope Gregory was doing. He was trying to boss around various kings. In reality, how much bossing around he actually did is more limited, because this confrontation with the Holy Roman Emperor, did it have long-term effects? It's more debatable. When Pope Gregory dies in 1085, he's actually being challenged at the time by a rival pope. Those who were opposed to what Pope Gregory was doing set up a rival papacy. And when Pope Urban becomes pope, who was from the same abbey as Gregory, they had a very similar kind of mindset in many ways. It actually takes Pope Urban 4 or 5 years before he actually managed to seize control of Rome itself. So he's not exactly kind of this great colossal political power if it takes him 4 or 5 years to actually seize the reins of power in Rome itself. But you can see the direction of travel. You've got the papacy beginning to try and have more interference, if you like, over church matters in the different kingdoms of the Christian world. So, to sum things up then, so this letter arrives, you got Pope Urban, It's part of this reforming papacy. The papacy for the previous 100 years has been trying to increase its power over spiritual matters. They're trying to increase their power over political matters. You've got this idea of a predecessor talking about holy war and remission of sins, but it was a bit too radical for when it was announced before. You've got Byzantium, who are writing this letter to the Pope, claiming that it was for, to cleanse them of the Islamic world, but then, as we know, the Islamic world hadn't really encroached any further into Byzantium for about 15 or 20 years. And it is likely that the Emperor of Byzantium was just hoping to get a small detachment of troops. So this was kind of the context. This is the events and the ideas that were swirling around when this letter arrived. So hopefully that helps. It might go towards a question like, was papal power or the position of Byzantium the most important reason why Urban II responded to that letter? Okay, I'll do some other videos in the not too distant future on other aspects of the Crusades.